Okay, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Right, just to repeat, everybody on the call, for the benefit of maybe the two people that have just entered the room, I am recording the presentation, so please just bear that in mind. If you want to turn your screen off, then by all means do so, but we will be recording this. And as long as it's okay with everybody, we will also be uploading it to YouTube after the event for the benefit of those who can't be joining us. Hi everyone, I think I know everybody on the call, but in case you don't know me, my name is Jim Cherrington. I'm a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University and the founder of CoMTB. And this is CoMTB, just to give a little bit of an overview of what this research group is. We are the first research group of its kind, really, to focus exclusively on why, how, and where mountain biking matters to people from around the world. We are an interdisciplinary, culturally diverse, and global group of researchers whose aim it is to understand the social, cultural, and political significance of mountain biking in contemporary societies. We've got lots of members from all over the world doing lots of interesting things in the world of mountain biking. We've got people with backgrounds in art, community development, psychology, sociology, cultural studies, journalism, marketing, and coaching. And I guess the thing that binds us as individuals, regardless of our background, is, as you'll see today, we're all passionate about helping organizations to address a range of identities, bodies, environments, and inequalities, among other things. One of the methods we'll be using to do this is through this seminar series. And the series itself will take place, as you'll see from the table on the right there, it will take place 4 times a year. This is the first of 4. And every one of these sessions will take place online. As part of a broader range of activities, the aim of the seminar series is to encourage evidence-informed discussions between lots of different groups of people, many of whom are represented on this call already. So we've got landowners, governing bodies, sport brands, and policymakers, as well as academics. And what we'd like to do as a group is to develop a kind of a joined up approach to finding applied solutions to some of many of the world's most pressing problems, things like climate change, colonialism, land enclosure, and so on and so forth. So this week, I'm really pleased to say that we'll be hearing from Liam Healy, who's on the call. I'll let Liam introduce himself because I'm not a fan of introducing other people formally. I'd much rather people do it themselves. So Liam, I'll leave Liam to introduce himself when his presentation starts. And then I've also prepared a presentation to begin with around the relationship between electronic mountain bikes, disability, and green exercise. If you want to sign up and register for future events, you can do so using the QR code down there on the bottom left-hand side of the table. You can also use the QR code at the bottom of the page there to access our website, which contains information on everybody involved in the group, their disciplines, their interests, their backgrounds, what their relationship is with mountain biking, as well as various events that we're involved in and publications that we've currently got underway. So that's a really good source of information if you're looking to keep up with the various activities that CoMTB are involved in. Just a very, very brief introduction to the structure of the sessions. I'm trying to keep the sessions short and sweet because I appreciate the timing of these, and not everybody can kind of stick around for 2 or 3 hours. So what I've done in each of the sessions, and today is no different, is I've organized each of the sessions around 2 20-minute presentations and half an hour of discussion with people in the audience. So real emphasis there on making sure we have conversations about the topics being presented, because that is one of the main remits of cultures of mountain biking. So really keen to get going with those discussions. Feel free to ask any questions, either on the call if you feel confident enough to do so, or via the chat, which I'll try and monitor once my presentation itself is finished. Okay, so moving straight on to my presentation for today then. I want to talk today about the relationship between disability, technology, and green exercise. This stems from work I conducted during lockdown, actually, with 30 electric mountain bikers, not all of whom had disabilities, but many of whom did. And what I'm really interested here is that kind of relationship between the technology of the electric mountain bike, how and in what ways it might help or hinder physical activity and exercise among disabled communities and disabled people, and specifically what that might tell us about exercise in green spaces, where, of course, as many of you know on the call, there are lots of complexities and contestations around who should be there, what objects should and shouldn't be there, and how we should police or manage all of those things. So initially, just to give you an idea about where this came from, over the last decade or so now, there's been a massive increase, as you may have seen, in the amount of research that's dedicated specifically to physical activity and mental health in the context of green exercise. So what green exercise can do to help improve both of those things. This, of course, has been against a backdrop of a global decline, especially in Western worlds, in Western societies, of physical activity and of mental health. And there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that green space can, in certain ways, play an important role in promoting physical activity, especially within certain marginalised communities. So to give an insight into this, based on the research, physically at least, exercising in nature is said to reduce hypertension, boost the immune system, and delay the onset of pain as well. So kind of reduce the amount of pain that people are suffering with. Psychologically, green physical activity is claimed to improve mood, enhance cognitive capacities, lower anxiety, and overall facilitate opportunities for self-nurturing. And it's against this backdrop that many advocates of green exercise have understandably started to make really bold and big claims about how green exercise can empower people to take responsibility for their own health, whilst also, and relatedly, providing sustainable and more accessible forms of physical activity for future generations. Now, I'm also a big advocate of that. I think that's great. But the more this emphasis on green exercise as a kind of catch-all solution for physical and mental illness has gained momentum, the more the social and cultural significance of nature has been marginalised from these public debates. So as someone like Sarah Bell, who writes a lot on this in relation to disability, suggests, as a result of this, we get carried away with the physical and mental benefits, but we seem to know a lot less about how green spaces might play out in the lives of people, for example, who suffer with impairments, who have disabilities, or the kinds of constraining ableist assumptions that might underpin the perceived most authentic way to engage with those spaces. So to put it really, really simply, with the exception of Sarah Bell's research on this, which is great, by the way, there's barely any research, shockingly for me, about how impaired exercisers might experience green spaces, and even less still, on how the experiences of disabled exercisers is enabled or disabled by different forms of technology. And between myself and James Brighton, who is the co-author and co-researcher on this paper, we wanted to address this. We wanted to look at this in a bit more detail. It just felt like electric mountain bikes were a perfect object to analyse in that respect. So in this short presentation, I just want to give an overview of the theoretical framework that guided the research. I want to briefly comment on the data that we collected, and then combine the two to try and examine how the theoretical framework that we adopted might have helped us to reach certain conclusions about e-mountain biking specifically, but also the impacts, both positive and negative, that this technology is having on impaired users of green spaces. So why did we conduct this research then? Well, as I've already mentioned from the outset, we tend to focus, despite having a relatively good understanding now of what mountain bikers are and what mountain bikers do, 20% it's estimated, which is kind of greater or lesser depending on the country, but 20% worldwide, globally, of all bikes being sold now on average are electric bikes, sorry. But what's quite surprising about this is in academia, at least, we still seem to know very little about people's reasons for buying e-mountain bikes, or perhaps most pressingly in this context, how these technologies might impact cultures of off-road cycling and all the things that go with that. Work by people such as Leslie Ingram Sills, who had a chapter in my recent edited book on mountain biking, has sought to address this and look at this and address this, fill this gap, if you like, in the literature. But it's safe to say that progress in this area is frustratingly slow. Now, for me, as someone who's interested and passionate about mountain biking and thinks that electric mountain bikes in particular can have something to add to these debates, I find this really frustrating, because on the one hand, e-mountain bikes have been identified as a tool that can actually help facilitate people's exercise in green spaces who might, in some cases, not otherwise be there. The other, I guess, pressing political or cultural issue is that the presence of an artificial object in a supposedly natural space raises all sorts of questions in these outdoor environments about who should be there, what kinds of bodies should we allow and disallow in outdoor spaces, which kind of bodies and people and communities are marginalized from these spaces. And in relation to disability, there are really specific questions here to ask around what we mean by disablement and assistance within green exercise, and how this might relate to certain ideological notions around nature, risk, adventure, and all those other things that tend to go with hand in hand with green spaces. So, as a way of addressing this, I spoke to 30 physically and mentally impaired e-mountain bike users. I conducted interviews with them. We had hour-long conversations about this, all of whom were in England. And together, collectively, we tried to make sense of some of the tensions that exist between e-mountain bike users and other users of the countryside, as well as some of the implications that such relations might have in terms of encouraging alternative conceptualizations of what it means to be disabled. To do this, and this is where the theory comes in that I want to touch on today briefly, we decided to put disability and green exercise in conversation with the work of someone called Bernard Stiegler, because we felt that Bernard Stiegler's work helps us to highlight the superficiality of existing ideologies of nature, whilst at the same time understanding the myriad ways that e-mountain bikes can challenge these ableist assumptions towards outdoor recreation. Okay, so just some quick notes then on the theoretical underpinnings of the study. We tend to find in existing studies on disability and green exercise, which is generally excellent, by the way. I'd recommend it if you get a few hours and you're interested in immersing yourself in that literature. It's really common for people to examine the ways in which disabled exercisers are understandably marginalized in green spaces. So in these contexts, disabled access to green exercise is positioned in one of two ways. The first is that we talk about the way in which there's a blatant regard for things like the grotesque, dysfunctional body that is seen as deviant in these outdoor spaces. And then on the other hand, you have a disregard for which kind of reinforces the ways in which certain bodies are overlooked within green spaces and not really given a chance to thrive. So if we think about this, we can think about it in the same way as we might look at certain other interventions in nature. So despite generally nature being intervened by humans all the time, we have things like cafes, stiles, footpaths that aid kind of both able and disabled bodies. It's often only those forms of intervention in natural space that relate specifically to disabled access, things such as handrails, chairlifts, accessible toilets, and the like, that tend to be seen as unacceptably contrived. And what this is the disabled body being disregarded. On the other hand, you've got an explicit regard for disabled bodies, which is evident in things like the attitudes and expectations of land managers and other recreational users of these outdoor spaces. So, for example, in a paper that I wrote recently on e-mountain bikes outside of the context of disability, we found that it was common for e-mountain bikers to comment on things like really small but subtle, and in some cases unremarkable interactions that they were having with other users of the countryside. Things like tutting, eye rolling, all of which tend to reinforce that these bodies, these technologies are othered, that they don't belong in those environments. And when we take these things together, so the regard and the disregard, these various forms of inclusion constitute a systematic process of social and cultural stigmatization, which in the long term and over a long period of time can lead to feelings of, especially when it comes to disabled users, feelings of helplessness, exclusion, and overall a reluctance to carry on exercising in those spaces. But, and this is the big but for James and I, important, critical, I guess, though these factors are in understanding how disabled exercise might be excluded from green spaces. The problem for us is that they're overly negative. They suggest that the only experiences that disabled or impaired users of these spaces might have is one where, you know, they're kind of abused, or they get upset, they might be anxious, they lack agency, they lack any imagination, and they only encounter nature in a negative way. As a result of that focus, important though that is, we tend to lose sight of the many ways in which nature encounters have been proven by the likes of Sarah Bell, who I've referenced on the slide there, in a way that promotes feelings of freedom, often from ableist attitudes towards the outdoors, and those pressures of perfectionism that we all experience when we enter into these spaces. And what we ignore, therefore, is in the same way, is that, you know, just like able-bodied exercises in green spaces, there are also moments for disabled exercisers of curiosity and exploration and adventure and upskilling, all those things that able-bodied and non-able-bodied participants might have in common. And that was really where we chose to emphasize the role of the electronic mountain bike. So for us, this is where Bernard Stiegler's approach to technology comes in. So I'll try and keep this as unflowery and as uncomplex as possible for those of you that might not be sociologists or philosophers, because I appreciate this is quite heavy stuff. But overall, Stiegler's life work, really, he passed recently, so he's not with us anymore. But Stiegler's life work was about looking at and trying to explain how technology isn't just a tool, but it's actually a form of mediation that profoundly influences our sense of humanity, our perceptions, our interactions, and all the possibilities that we have as human beings. They're all mediated by technology. So he was trying to move away from this idea that technology is just an object or an implement, but it actually, he was suggesting, fundamentally influences and mediates everything we are and everything we do as human beings. So in this sense, Stiegler actually goes as far in his writing to suggest that what makes us unique as human beings isn't necessarily our genetic composition, our biological composition, our cerebral capacities as humans, which is the one thing that is always talked about in differentiating us from animals, but actually that we're all defined by nothingness, we're all defined by lack. And for Stiegler, it's actually technology that supplements that lack, that allows us to feel human. And what's great about that in relation to disability is that it suggests that we all have a shared dependence on technology, and by extension are thus all equally vulnerable to the consequences of its use, for better and for worse. So when applied to things like disability, we can see here that rather than technologies such as wheelchairs, e-mountain bikes, tents being universally good or bad, It's actually the social milieu, the social relationships that we have with those things and that go around it that influence how we interpret and position them. And so when we look at this in the context of e-mountain biking, which I think is quite useful, we can see this, the problem with e-mountain bikes, and they're often deemed to be a problem, as we know, is not in the technology, in the object of the bike itself, but it's actually in the fact that forms of care and attention that we used to dedicate to ensuring technologies such as this were responsibly and ethically used are unfortunately being hijacked by the kind of constant stimulation and distraction that comes with things like computers, smartphones, social networking sites, and so on and so forth. And what these things have done to our relationship with technology is that it's resulted in a shallower mode of engagement with the world and with others, and a diminished capacity for critical thinking and reflection. So this is where things get quite exciting for me with Stiegler's work, because he calls for a reevaluation and more attention dedicated to the practices that surround technological use, and to try and reimagine ways in which we can cultivate focused, deep engagement with those various technological uses and implements. And in the context of the present study, we'd argue that disabled e-mountain bike users are actually really well placed to usher in this new world of reflection and focused engagement, both because they tend to be the victims more often than not, because of the bikes they're riding, of stigma and abuse. So it's really close to them, quite raw. But also because these riders tend to be really critical about some of those opinions, and tend to, in my experience of interviewing them, reimagine relationships with technology that can, in some cases, lead to more diverse and creative ways of using these technologies. Overall, then, when it comes to disability, what I really like about Stiegler's work and how it applies to e-mountain bikes is that it helps us to reject and reimagine some of those often binary opposites between things like disablement and able-bodiedness, what is healthy and unhealthy, what is normal and abnormal. And it allows us to celebrate rather than denigrate that intermeshing of technology, which in this case is e-mountain bikes, nature, which is important, Stiegler wrote on this as well, and the disabled body. Okay, so that's the theory. They're the ideas that we found useful in kind of prefacing some of our findings. I'll just spend the last part of my presentation just going through some of the things that came out of the interviews and what we concluded from what people were saying. The first thing that we noticed from a lot of these responses from these interviews, these 30 interviews with disabled or impaired users of the countryside on e-mountain bikes, was that they were clearly being subject to these forms of regard that I highlighted earlier on. And what was really insightful here was that this regard could be further subcategorized into two different categories. The first was in relation to the public's perception that the use of their bikes, which, you know, this will be second nature to a lot of you on the call who are kind of au fait with these debates, but the first thing they got accused of regularly was cheating. And as is common, unfortunately, this often resulted in verbal abuse from other users of green space that was directed deliberately at these disabled e-mountain bikers. So two quotes here, for example, that illustrate this. Julie says that it was sunny, so everybody was sitting outside in a cafe, and I was going past and this bloke just shouted that I was a cheat. Kelly similarly says, I went to X Woods once, which is a location that I've anonymized. I was riding past a group of kids and they all shout, cheat, cheat, cheat. I thought, they don't have a clue. Wait till you're 42 and you've got arthritis. So that was kind of that regard, that explicit regard that people were receiving, which was very overt, very obvious. But the second thing that also meant they were being regarded was this idea that e-bikes were in some way lazier than people who didn't use a motor. So one of the participants, for example, said that his mates told him that he's a lazy old man who doesn't want to pedal anymore. Someone else said that their friends regard them as being a bit soft. They'd feel a bit soft, and I think they'd feel a bit soft, my friends, if they had an e-bike. Now, what's interesting here about how this kind of relates to dominant tropes in existing literature on disability studies. The first is they illustrate how the disabled body is negatively stereotyped as being less capable, less intelligent, less productive, and kind of perpetuating that belief that they are in some way deficient compared to non-disabled users. And the other thing that came from this is that it kind of provides evidence for that idea that the disabled body is commonly positioned as passive or weak, or necessarily relies on assistance from other objects and people rather than being active objects or active agents in their own meaning making, their own lives. One further thing that I haven't mentioned on the slide here that has just kind of jogged my memory is that the amount of people abuse disabled users received was directly proportional to how visible their disability was. So one of the interviewees told me a really interesting story where he was saying that he has problems with the use of his legs, but you wouldn't necessarily know he had. Someone called him a cheat. He got off his bike and kind of hobbled towards this other user of the countryside. And after that, the guy who had called him a cheat very quickly realized that he had a disability and therefore immediately started to apologize. Where participants had really visual disabilities, like, for example, when people had MS, which was a couple of my participants had MS, and it was really visually obvious that was the case, they received less abuse because they were seen as being more dependent on that form of technology for their leisure. So I just find that fascinating in terms of how disability may or may not be stigmatized. Okay, on a slightly cheerier note, which was great to see, participants also talked about certain affordances that were provided by the electronic mountain bike. So participants talked about how the motor became a physical extension of their body, and that in many cases this allowed them to lessen, or in some cases overcome, the perceived effects of their impairment. So Hannah, who I've not listed on the slide here, but Hannah talks about how there's two types of, Hannah is represented in this quote at the top. Hannah suggests that there are two types of people that she would break, three types of people, excuse me, that she would break the beneficiaries of e-mountain bike technology down to. When she says there are people who've lost limbs or whose fitness has been massively impacted by an incident. That's the first one. There's a large group of people whose fitness isn't where they want it to be. And then there's older people. For example, our friends who are in their 60s who have just bought e-bikes because their knees are pretty much shot. Across all three of these groups, individuals felt much less limited by certain long-term health conditions. So we had people with asthma, heart disease, MS, multiple sclerosis, as I mentioned, spinal cord injuries was a common one, knee osteoarthritis, and obesity was another one. And for many of these people, psychologically, this was said to provide a real morale boost. It allowed them to get out and do the things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. Now, what I've always advocated, and this is no different in this case, but what I've always advocated is to kind of, whilst understanding the significance of those physical benefits, it's also bearing in mind a lot of the time that social benefits follow from this as well. And in this study, this was absolutely no different. So someone like Darren, for example, one of my other participants, was talking about the modes on the bike and the choice that he gets. And these kind of sentiments were expressed by lots of other participants as well. This ability to choose between how much assistance you get, turning the boost mode on when you get tired. Becky, who was a sufferer of MS, saying that she enjoyed being able to ride up the ups as well as go down the downs. And then there's people as well who talked about riding increasingly technical stuff where they might otherwise not be able to with another bike. And what I loved about this was that the knock-on effect of this ability to choose was it had a direct impact on their social lives. So another participant, for example, says, in my experience of riding e-mountain bikes, it can be a bit of an equalizer. in my riding group, there's one guy who's actually quite fit, but he's got some medical problems, so he's a bit anemic and struggles a bit, although he was actually doing very well yesterday on his bike. The other lad is getting on a bit, and he's probably heavier than he should be, and he's not that fit, so he can really struggle. But having an e-mountain bike allowed us to ride together and have a laugh without worrying about how fit we were or how much we were suffering with our knees or our lungs or whatever. I guess in this sense, perhaps the most powerful affordance that I think you might associate with an e-mountain bike is that ability to delegate the physical output of the e-mountain bike motor, which by extension allows participants to focus on the social aspect of riding rather than just being obsessed with their breathing or how tired their legs are, and therefore shift their experience of riding a bike away from their perceived physical inadequacies. Okay, so just one final thing then. I think this is, for me, the most heartwarming and promising aspect of people's relationship with e-mountain bikes. And this was in the way that a lot of people felt like their e-mountain bike made them feel superhuman. Now, of course, if you read the literature around this in disability studies around things like the term superhuman, this is a term that's widely problematized for its suggestion that, all disabled people, the only way they can overcome disability is by being in some way superhuman rather than just kind of normal or human. And there is a risk here that we might kind of normalize this. Participants might normalize this in the context of, rehabilitation and just wanting to get better and using the mountain bike as a way of getting better or becoming more normal. But going back to what I said about regard, when participants have been subject to this intense level of regard through verbal or in some cases physical abuse by members of the public, the benefit of that is they became really suspicious of the demarcation of nature and technology. So to give an example, Jenny talked about a confrontation she had with the user of the outdoors, and she was kind of pointing out that despite people having a go at her for using an artificial object in a supposedly natural space, you look around you, especially in the Peak District, and you've got dams, tractors, things like golf courses. Other parts of the world, you've got ski lifts, artificial whitewater rafting facilities. But none of these things, or rarely are these things actually ever positioned as being unnatural. But as I said before, these things tend to garner much less attention than e-mountain bikes. And the participants were conscious of this. So what they did was they started shifting emphasis onto, which reflects the work of Papadimitriou, as listed on the slide there, who talks about becoming unwheeled, how people actually via, in his case, he's talking about wheelchairs, but this could equally transfer onto mountain bikes. How people through a process of embodiment or re-embodiment use an e-bike and make it part of their embodied existence. So throughout the interviews, for example, participants talked about how their bodies and their bikes were kind of worked together to facilitate new ways of moving through these natural recreation spaces. So one of my participants, Rob, gave a really succinct indication of how this might be manifest in riding any mountain bike, when he says, it's quite interesting compared to how you use your own physiology. It's kind of like an energy supply, if you like. It's an energy supply that you can use up, but once it's started, it gets depleted. So you have to ride more occasionally so that the battery doesn't die. And there are numerous responses whose responses didn't make it onto the slide here, said very similar things. But all of them were talking about how their experience of that meshing of bike and body became central to the experience of riding a trail or riding any mountain bike trail. So in line with broader kind of, for those of you in the room who might be in any way philosophically or sociologically inclined, you might know that there's a big movement now towards kind of what's being described as post-human or new materialist disability studies. What this illustrates for me and for us is that there's these mechanical assemblages that are formed between human and technology. And these assemblages, or if you're not this way inclined, just think of them as collections of objects and behaviors, can actually push disabled riders to go beyond modern understandings of what constitutes properly or acceptably human or technical behaviors. And in the process, it actually helps us to challenge what we mean by this very notion of disability. So overall, I guess I'd say, despite the stick that electric mountain bikers might get on trails in natural environments, it turns out that actually these technologies can be incredibly immersive, they can be empowering, and perhaps most importantly, they can be quite politically transgressive for impaired users of the outdoors, which I think is great. Right, so just to wrap up then, so technology, it's not going away. It's always has been a part of the outdoors and green spaces, and it would seem that it's probably always going to be, maybe increasingly so. So we can't avoid that. And one of the things that Bernard Stiegler encourages us to do is to not stray away from that, but actually take responsibility for that and start to figure out how we might think about these new technological and human assemblages or collections of behavior. What we hope to have done in this study is, by exploring electronic mountain bike use, we can see how it's subject to many of those negative ableist attitudes that we get about access to natural spaces. And you know, disabled people for kind of decades now have been subject to kind of ideological forms of movement and certain ways of thinking and acting in these green spaces. So the mountain bike can help us to challenge that, which is great. Specifically, I think we've highlighted here that it's subject to a form of regard, which actively highlights the problematic nature of disabled bodies, but almost as problematic is the sense of disregard, when bodies are ignored or not given the attention that maybe they deserve, both in the literature and in people's experience of green spaces. But what e-mountain bikes ultimately and positively allow people to do is they allow people to transgress some of these stereotypes and form new identities, new ways of acting and thinking and feeling in green spaces, which are altogether much more empowering than the ones that might have preceded it. And so overall, I'd say if there was one contribution that I think our study can make, it's about understanding, in the context of critical disability studies and green exercise, how socio-technical and social natural indeterminacy or kind of confusion about what bodies are and where they should be can actually, in many cases, serve to challenge the forms of oppression that disabled people might face, whilst at the same time promoting more diverse and creative and I guess imaginative versions of what it might mean to exercise in lived environments. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much. Cheers, Liam. What we'll do, guys, if it's okay by you, is we'll have the two presentations and then we'll have a nice long discussion afterwards. If you joined us a bit later or maybe midway through my presentation, I think there were two people who did that. And just bear in mind, please, that you can. Well, first of all, this Zoom call is being recorded, so that's the first thing to say. The second thing is that if you've got any questions and don't necessarily want to air those in public, feel free to just pop them on the chat and we'll come to them when we come to the discussion at the end. Okay, without further ado, I shall pass on to Liam, who's going to talk about trail building and ecologies of practice. All I will say about Liam is he's a lecturer and researcher at Sheffield University, just over the road from me. Liam's also got a chapter in my book on the cultures of mountain biking, and he's going to talk to us today, about ecologies of trail building. Cheers, Liam.
Cool. Thanks, Jim. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that.
Cheers,
so
mate.
many questions. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Cool. Great. Yeah, just give me a head shake or a finger wag if I'm going over too much, if I'm rambling on. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me. My name's Liam. I'm based at the Architecture School in Sheffield. And I've been doing research for a few years on, I mean, I am a bike rider and have been for God knows how long, 20, 25 years probably. And also a trail builder, and I've kind of in the last couple of years sort of turned my academic attention to that as well. So yeah, as Jim said, I've written a chapter in the book, and I've written some work on sort of maintenance and care of trails, and especially kind of DIY trails and sort of wild trails, I suppose people often call them, or pirate trails was the most recent term that I've come across. And I've sort of put together this presentation really, it's really half-baked ideas, partly because I was hoping that this could be a space to sort of test something out and get some kind of feedback and ideas from everybody else. So yeah, slightly selfish as well. So yeah, really intrigued to kind of hear any thoughts on what I'm saying. I recognize that there's a lot that I'm not saying in this, and so I think it'll be interesting to kind of pick up on that perhaps. And I suppose just as a very kind of brief introduction, my kind of rationale for looking at trails through this kind of notion of an ecology of practice is their sort of fragility. So in the book, I sort of in Jim's book, I sort of talk about how trails are sort of fragile all the way down. They're sort of fragile in terms of how they're held together. They're fragile in terms of how they often have to remain secret. They're fragile in terms of the kind of weather that you can see, like in this image, that sort of starts to destroy them and break them apart. And so I wanted to use this or kind of think with this notion of an ecology of practice, which I'll kind of introduce shortly, or certainly kind of how I have come to understand it. So I sort of, again, unapologetically or perhaps apologetically, following on from Jim, there's quite a lot of heavy theory in this, and partly because I know that Jim likes to talk theory. So I thought it would be nice to sort of, yeah, kind of try and weave that through the mud and through the trails, if you like. So I'm taking this concept of an ecology of practice from a philosopher and originally a trained chemist, Isabel Stenger. So she's a kind of philosopher of science. So slightly kind of unlikely reference, perhaps, for looking at trail building. But I think that she provides some really interesting concepts and ways of thinking about practices kind of generally, but normally sort of scientific practices that I think can be taken up in lots of different sort of fields, and some sort of testing out whether this can work in looking at trail building. As a kind of side note, she also provides this notion of in catastrophic times that inspired Jim's edited collection. Was that from last year, Jim? Or the year before? Yeah. So yeah, I'll just quickly read out this quote. So Isabel Stenger demands of us that no practice be defined as like any other, just as no living species is like any other. Approaching a practice then means approaching it as it diverges, that is, feeling its borders, experimenting with the questions which practitioners may accept as relevant. So for me, as she says, it's all about looking at the specifics of a given practice. So what is it? What is it? The specifics of DIY trail building that are different to any other kind of practice, or any other kind of trail building practice even, or other DIY practice for that matter. So it's about this kind of resistance to sameness, and saying, look, there's this practice or this process that's going on. It's just like this one. So kind of resisting that urge. So she talks about an ecology of practice as a tool for thinking through what is happening, and kind of reminds us that a tool is never neutral, right? It's very kind of specific and becomes quite situated. It's not up here, but she in this chapter, the introductory notes on an ecology of practice, she goes on to say that the relevant tools, the tools for thinking, are the ones that address and actualize the power of the situation, that make it a matter of particular concerns. In other words, make us think and not recognize, right? So I take this reading to be around using tools for thinking as opposed to trying to equivocate or kind of look for similarities in things. so kind of in that vein, it's important to say that what I intend to do is look at the sort of specifics of DIY trail building and not others. So this is why I introduced and said there's lots missing here, right? This is, for me, this is like very specific and very situated. And it's not so that the things that I'm describing can be kind of lifted and applied elsewhere, but so that we can kind of take them seriously and sort of use this tool of an ecology of practice to work out what we might learn from them. But I would say it's very important that it's not, I don't think these should be sort of thought as methods. It's not so that we can kind of look at this thing, borrow it and apply it somewhere else, but to sort of think through the very specifics of them. And to do that, Stengers provides these two kind of tools, if you like, this notion of obligations and requirements of specific practices that I'm gonna come back to later. And to do that and to try and get there, I'm going to tell three very quick stories from my experience trail building. And each one of these will speak to a kind of theme. So the first will be prototyping, the second apprenticeships, and the third obligations and requirements. I realize I'm sort of talking really in abstract here, so I'm going to try and situate it in the mud. So first up, prototyping. As a sort of designer and someone that's been educated in design, this is something that's quite kind of is like a large interest of my work. And I think that trails provide quite an interesting and novel form of prototyping. So I'll just tell the first very quick story. And these are kind of lifted from kind of unedited field notes that I've kept over the last few years. So I come back to the dig this week, and what we jokingly called the berm inspection unit has been in and moved the corner I built last week. They've moved it back by a few feet. I protest that it was better where I had stacked it, but eventually relent that it probably does line you up better for the next jump now. Obviously, no one knows. It's all trying to feel it out in your head, and it's interesting to try and navigate the delay between building and testing. There's a temporality to the prototyping process, a kind of seasonal rotation. So we need to wait until the trail has dried up to figure out if it will work. And then after that, we'll argue over how to make it work and start over again. The next job is to build out the flat bottom between the berm and the last jump on the track. After the flat bottom, we need to pull out a stump and stack up the takeoff. This one's a big one, and we joke around who is going to be the guinea pig for it. We agree not to build it with rocks because the jump will most likely have to be moved once it's been tested. It's a lot easier to move a takeoff than a landing. So at this point, the trail is still really provisional, right? It's like, it's a prototype that's going to emerge throughout the season. We're kind of trying to play it out in our heads, kind of using previous experience, like, is this going to work? Is this going to line up? There's obviously lots of debates and arguments between different builders and people who know better or worse. But I think when we kind of contrast this with more conventional or kind of organized trail building, there's a very different sort of materiality and kind of practice that's going on. So in this image here, there's a real kind of degree of permanence. These things can't be moved easily. They require like training, they require certain people to come in, they require lots of material, they require lots of money. And in the same way as the kind of rocks in the takeoff that I sort of alluded to in the field note, it's kind of done once it's done. And it's all about a kind of pre-planning and then getting the track built. So I think there's something really interesting here around the sort of process of DIY trail building, where it's always emerging, always kind of in this state of becoming, if you like. It's never fixed, never finished, which is kind of reflected in both the materiality and the tools that are used to build it. So, for example, the whacker plate, is this very sort of official tool that seems to sort of signify the end of the trail build. It's like the last process that runs through the trail. And it's very different to you know, stamping something in with your feet, or kind of kicking a line down a woodland for you to sort of play on. And there's a lot of literature around prototyping in design and in sociology. I don't really have that much time to go through it here, but I guess at its most basic, prototyping is this kind of provisional arrangement of things that are used to sort of test something out. So this is a quote from the sociologist Michael Guggenheim, who describes prototyping. He says, "It's always existed, and probably for most of human history has been more important than its opposite, orderly science and planning." So he's kind of talking about how in human history, it's the question of what gets built is very rarely kind of planned out in advance. Often it's kind of cobbled together, it's kind of bricolaged, and kind of emerges over time in different sort of generations. So most of the time, prototyping is thought of as this kind of iteration that needs testing, that can then be tested again, and then kind of results in a new prototype, and back and forth. But they're still sort of speculative in nature, right? They require a little bit of guesswork at the beginning. You kind of jump into the unknown to begin with, but normally it's towards some kind of fixed outcome or kind of final product is the sort of classic thing in product design. But then more recently, there's been this kind of notion of cosmopolitical prototyping. So this is again kind of a bit of an Isabel Stengers fanboy. So this is kind of informed by Isabel Stengers' notion of cosmopolitics. I'm just going to give you this quote here from Rubio and Fogg, who have described cosmopolitical prototyping quite neatly, I think. They say it's a process that is not focused on the capacity of design to prescribe codes into action and thought, but on its capacity to propose and open up the possibility of new forms of action and thought, or what we call the unfolding capacities of design. And so I think this quite neatly starts to describe what trail building could be, right? And I don't think I've quite worked out what this means for trail building, but I think there's something quite exciting about this possibility, where the construction or the kind of provisional arrangement of a trail begins to open up the possibility of new action and thought, right? Or new kinds of relationships between humans, non-humans, environments, technologies, bikes, and so on. So I'd really love to hear what, if this kind of chimes with people, like what does this kind of notion of cosmopolitical prototyping do in relation to bike riding and trail building? I'm realizing that I'm going over time a little bit, so I'm going to speed up. Getting the nod there from Jim. So the second sort of story relates to this notion of apprenticeships. So again, I'm just going to read very briefly from kind of field notes over the next couple of slides. So a few younger boys joined for tonight's dig and are quickly put to work on a mattock to start hacking out an old berm. Charlie notices that one of them is using the mattock incorrectly, bending over it without moving their hands and not using the weight of the pick over their heads with a straight back. He spends a bit of time explaining and demonstrating how to use it, explaining how you can get most out of the weight of the pick, like the old expression my dad used to say, let the tool do the work, and how to avoid damaging your back. It seems like a bit of a given that anyone could use a pick, but of course, we've all been doing this for 20 or more years and take for granted that you have to learn somewhere. The older diggers are generally pretty generous. They don't make any fun and take time out to explain how to use it. It also means now that the youngsters are making much shorter work of the berm. I've talked to Charlie about this before when I suggested that we could pay a contractor to help with surfacing parts of the track. But he makes a really strong argument that we need to invest in the youngsters to get them excited about digging, because this is what will keep the spot going. If they just showed up to a finished tarmac spot, Charlie feels they won't appreciate it. It won't feel like it's theirs. I somewhat agree. Obviously, there's a balance. It needs to seem achievable at the same time as inviting agency. Many of my friends through the years quit riding because of the work it took to maintain trails. So I think there's got to be some middle ground. So to kind of think through this example, I've become interested in the some writing from the anthropologist, probably going to pronounce this name wrongly, Jean Lave, and the educational theorist Etienne Wenger. And they have this concept of legitimate peripheral participation. And I think this is a really useful concept because it describes the ways that newcomers interact with old timers and become what they call a community of practice. And the Lave and Wenger focus on quite a broad understanding of apprenticeships as this sort of process of situated learning that's not just limited to workplaces. They actually say they want to kind of rescue apprenticeships from this for only being associated with that. So I think this becomes really interesting to think through what a kind of DIY apprenticeship is and how that kind of might be done. So with this in mind, in trail building, there's this kind of sort of process of learning that I guess starts with a kind of bodily engagement with bike riding, like learning to ride a bike skillfully as a kind of user, like a user of that space. But then that person's intentions become kind of configured through in the process of becoming a sort of full participant, right? By actually participating in that spot's socio-cultural practices and forming that spot, you know. So, you know, so there's this kind of shift from what starts out as a user that by becoming engaged in the repair and maintenance of those places and by shadowing the kind of old timers, they sort of become a fully fledged member, right? And this happens through quite basic tasks, like you begin by filling wheelbarrows with dirt, or by hacking out the berm, or by raking leaves, and then you kind of graduate to a shaper. So there's this kind of quite strict hierarchy, like you become responsible for the design of the trail. You can have your opinions heard, and this sort of final shaping of the features. And I think there's something interesting here as well, where those are really they're quite highly fought over and guarded, right? There's a lot of kind of informal negotiation and debate, fighting even, and they're kind of quite specific again to a given spot or a different or a given kind of spot. Okay, how am I doing for time? I've still got a few minutes. So on to the kind of the last kind of section, I suppose. And I'm going to return to Stenger's again and kind of think with her notion of obligations and requirements. And I'm kind of aware that I'm probably stretching her concepts a little bit too far. But I think that within her, yeah, I'm not trying to sort of compare trail building and the sort of scientific practices that she's kind of thinking through. But I really kind of appreciate that she kind of invites this idea of a tool for thinking. So without going into too much detail around how she defines this notion of an obligation and a requirement, I think there's a tool for thinking what an obligation and requirement of a DIY trail is, right? And how that might be different to official trail building. And there's something there that kind of matters, and I think that I want to try and pay attention to. So I think the first thing that's perhaps quite obvious is that, and this is a quote that a friend said to me recently. He said, "I want a track that scares me." So the kind of obligation of a trail is to scare and to excite. And it kind of made me realize that, I mean, some of the trails that I build, I'll probably never hit because I'm too scared. I don't know if I'll ever actually go on them. And so, but I think there's something really interesting there around how there's this kind of quest for, and I'm going to quote it's someone who I quote in the book chapter, actually, one of the very early sort of scholars of sort of lifestyle sports is Nancy Madol, and she had this notion of a kind of quest for a moment of ecstasy. And I think that this is what is really kind of driving these DIY trails. And it also points to this quite thorny issue that tracks shouldn't necessarily be sanitized. They need to have this very or this is the opinion of trail builders, that they need to have this quite carefully balanced and also relative sort of sketchiness, this kind of feeling of slight terror, and also this kind of the possibility of progress and of learning, right, to get through another trail or to get through something that's harder. And I think, to kind of go back to my very first point, this is to do with their fragility. This is why they also may need to sort of stay in the shadows and remain quite secret, right? Because those two are kind of incompatible. Like, for something to be scary as its kind of defining feature. I'm just going to slightly thicken this. I'm going to return to the kind of mattock story that I started telling. So while Charlie was demonstrating the mattock, I started to think about health and safety. Here we are, shoveling, cutting, packing, without any of the training that you might get on an official dig day. Of course, no one's filled in a risk assessment, and I think about my university's risk aversion and ethics committees. I'm glad they're not here. Where would I even start on the form anyway? Putting your back out from using a shovel incorrectly kind of seems insignificant when you think about the risk associated with the jumps we're building. So in this story, there's still this kind of obligation towards safety, but it's kind of inflected with risk. There's kind of risk running through that. There's this kind of outward kind of care towards the diggers that really runs through everything that's happening here. You know, you'd walk your friend off the hill if they'd hurt themselves, but there's still this kind of general encouragement of the possibilities for pain and injury that has to always run through this. Like, that's the thing that kind of underpins this practice and that motivates this practice. And again, not to kind of try and stretch Stenger's definitions too far, but this quote, that obligation refers to the fact that a practice imposes upon its participants certain risks and challenges that create the value of the activity, that really kind of chimed with me, right? So it is this kind of this risk that produces the value, or that becomes the intrinsic value of what we're doing here. And the other kind of half of that, to go back to Stenger's, is requirement. And so she talks about requirement as reflecting the normative and risky dimension of dependence on a milieu. That is, on what may or may not fulfill needs and demands, right? So this kind of dependence on its sort of surroundings and its settings, right? And so I think this notion of needs and demands is really interesting. Like, on the surface, the demands of, you know, just to see it on a surface level, DIY trail builders don't really have any demands. They're not really kind of legible, but perhaps they begin to sort of underscore a way of being and practicing, especially when you sort of think about quote unquote lifestyle sports. And I think that the final, I really love these memes from Blood, Sweat and Builds. Maybe some of you have seen them. The final kind of aspect relating to these is the process of building itself. This is a kind of meme page that's set up just, I don't think I've ever seen a bike on this meme page. It's all about building DIY trails. And I think it's, you know, so another one of these, another kind of requirement, if you like, is that this is not just about riding. This is about the process of building. There's another kind of moment of ecstasy, you know, to take Nancy Madol's quote again, which is to be quote unquote in the pit, to be digging, to be maintaining, to be kind of out being excited with a group of friends. And I think perhaps more importantly or interestingly is the imagination of what the trail will feel like, the kind of stoke that comes with that imagination, the kind of risk associated with it working or not. And so the kind of requirement there is entirely speculative and imaginative. It kind of exists in the builders' minds, and it's to do with the kind of the future you, right? The kind of future sessions with friends, the future good times in the summer. So there's something there that I find really, really interesting and exciting. So just to very briefly kind of recap, I guess it's important for me to say that I'm definitely not arguing against safely built official trails. In fact, I'm not taking a position here. But I think the fact is that there will always be DIY tracks. And I think there's a bunch of problematic stuff associated with them that I haven't talked about here. I have talked about in the past. In fact, I've talked about in the book chapter. Like, these practices and communities tend to be super macho, often quite homophobic, very white. This has kind of changed in the last, in very recent years. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think given, in spite of all of that, I think there's still a lot to be learned from DIY. And I think it'd be interesting to kind of hear from perhaps those that are more engaged in official trail building around sort of what the kind of discourse could be around this. What can we kind of learn from each other, I suppose. I think that's it. And I didn't go too far over time.
I think you kept the time a lot better than I did, Liam, in the end. So it was ironic, given that I warned you at the start not to go over time, and it was ended up being my fault. So the apologies are all mine.
No worries.
Graham's got a question. Do you want to pop your mic on, Graham, and ask it?
Yes, if the computer does the work. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, to be fair, I could probably talk to both of you for hours on both of these things, as Jim would attest to. What's been really interesting about both of these for me is that in terms of the sort of my experience out there, you're providing me in my work life with the evidence that it isn't just me anecdotally going, this is the kind of stuff I think is happening, which is really good, and it helps me have better conversations, that it isn't just the grumpy old bloke in the corner saying, yeah, but you're wrong, this is what I think. The on the stuff that you put forward there, Jim, it is really interesting, having done a lot of work with people like Experienced Community and disabled riders and stuff. It's so last year, as an example, we took part in the Dirty Reaver, and there were a lot of our Rafa clad gravelistas cycling past the guys on hands and girls on hand cycles and things, going, that's amazing, that's brilliant, you're doing so well. But they also cycled past a pair of ladies who basically kept up with us the whole way around, who are probably suffering far more than we were, and they didn't pay any attention to them. If anything, they did those kind of sideways glances, and it was a real, that image and that perception of what these things. And if they'd been on e-bikes, it would have been really miserable to be part of. There's such a culture around the e-bike and what that actually means to the person on it, that it would be amazing if we could change that, and that sort of judgment that happens with all those things. And again, and the stuff that Liam was talking about there, it's really interesting as a sort of landowner, kinda. It's really interesting in some respects.
Sorry to interrupt, Graham. Is it worth just pointing out what you do for a living?
No.
Everyone might know. No, okay.
So no, it's fine. So I work for the National Trust, and I try and help places engage better with people with wheels. I think it's the simplest way of looking at it.
Nice.
And so things like trail building and stuff is a really fascinating one. If in appropriate places, in some respects, if the stuff is built so it's technically hard to ride and you hurt yourself, that's okay, within obviously reason. But if the stuff isn't built properly, or the people who are building it hurt themselves, or by the stuff they do, they hurt other people, actually, it's more challenging for us as landowners as well to manage that, which is sometimes more of a challenging conversation to have with people. It's not, we don't want them to, to engage with those spaces, and that this whole engagement with nature and how people to choose to do that is something we talk about a lot. A person digging some jumps in the wood is engaging it. They're just not going out and hugging trees, for example. Two kind of extremes there. But yeah, it's a really fascinating one. You talk about the diggers thinking about their health and safety, but actually it gets complicated then, because they, if Joe Bloggs does his back in, that's one thing. But they're happy then for a person to, I suppose, consciously decide to try things that are hard and therefore could hurt themselves. All of this stuff is really interesting. Like I say, it makes my life easier when I talk to other people, that it isn't just me saying this is kind of the stuff I think. There's kind of some academic rigor behind some of these things, and so just keep going. It makes my life better going forward, that's for sure.
I was just going to say, I think that's where I'm really excited about that notion of apprenticeships, where there's because it's such a young sport, that you've got this kind of group of I know I look quite young, but I'm quite old people who can who will kind of bring up the youngsters and can say, well, look, if you're going to build that jump in the woods, then you need to make sure that the exit is safe. You need to make sure that you've got a kind of qualifier at the beginning. You need to make sure there's lines of sight so that it is safe, as safe as it can be. And like I say, there's always going to be this kind of inflection of risk running through all of this stuff. Like that will never go away. That's just how humans are, isn't it? But if we can kind of really work on that, and I think if we can also bring in those other older builders and get them to appreciate what it is they can do for other people, for different spots, for the National Trust land even, right? It's I think there's something really exciting there for me that I'm really interested in.
Definitely. And I visit loads of sites within the trust, and they all come with their own little foibles and designations and stuff, but actually one bit of dirt over there, actually to work with that and make something that is sustainable, but well built, rise well, and so on, could be completely different in terms of that build to a mile down the road, just because of the nature of the terrain, the tree cover, and all that sort of stuff. And I think that where we've had better relationship with the trail builders, there's an inherent hierarchy of people, where it's just a disparate group of random folk who just turn up, and going back to that person moving the berms and stuff, someone will work on it on a Wednesday, and then someone else will randomly turn up on a Friday and change it all. It just never works as well. It just doesn't seem to have the same impact, and everything that gets kind of built there just never lasts, because no one ever really can sort of agree. Well, it would appear anything at times, principles of building or anything. It's that hierarchy is really important.
I think just to add to that, Graham, I think Liam's whole presentation was essentially great evidence for our negotiations with a certain landowner with People's CoMTB at the moment, because it kind of it suggests that there's a nuance to off-piste trail building and riding, which I don't think is often. I think that's taken for granted, and it gives us the evidence to suggest that maybe there are certain trail builders who can be almost like stewards of that land and genuinely look after it and care for it in a way that maybe not even the landowner does.
I mean, it's a very specific. There's assuming that the trail is okay where it is in terms of all the other stuff that goes on within a woodland. But there's some of the trails that exist in the Surrey Hills that are now essentially formal trails. They all started as informal trails, but they're still engaging with the original trail building people who understand working in that landscape and have an understanding of, if this happens here, then this will happen there, and they are the people on the ground who know those kind of nuances that a range that covers, I don't know, X hectares of woodland doesn't quite get that detail, and that I think that any evidence that can help us, talk to these landowners around actually the worth of these people. They're not just middle-aged yobbos who come out with a shovel and vandalize stuff. They do care, and they want things to be built properly and built well. That'd be good.
Mm. Yeah, and that, going back to what you said about disability, it's a real problem, isn't it? That almost as much of a problem as the people kind of being abused or stigmatized is the pity that is leveled at people with impairments. Because I've spoken to loads of people with impairments, with disabilities, who will tell you the same thing. It's like it's patronizing. And it in sociology we call it like the kind of medical tragedy model. It's the idea that, like, if you have a disability, it's the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to you, and you should be pitied on that basis, and your whole raison d'etre, your whole reason for living, should be therefore to recoup some sense of normality. But I spoke to, I'm not exaggerating, I spoke to two of these e-mountain bikers with disabilities who told me that becoming disabled was almost one of the best things that ever happened to them, because it freed them from all of those traditional expectations about how you should move and act in sport and physical activity, and it exposed them to a completely new world of, in this case, e-mountain biking, that carries with it different forms of sociality, different friendship groups, different ways of moving, different relationships with the outdoors. And overall, it just told me that although it's just a real problem for me that you would treat an e-mountain biker as universally disregarding the environment, because almost because of all those things I've just mentioned, you find a lot of e-mountain bikers, especially those with disabilities, feel like they really appreciate what they've got and want to look after it more and understand, really conscientious about the impact that those technologies are having on the environment, and therefore want to offset that by doing other things. Like, a lot of them join kind of advocacy groups or trail building communities to try and offset some of the damage they do. And that is all because of the e-bike, not in spite of it. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, no, it is. The more every time I speak to the people involved in, for those who don't know about Experience Community, it's a disability access group, sort of based at the top end of the peak, and they I suppose they tend to do more on the people who are more physically disabled and who can ride a standard e-bike. But we have an awful lot of like I say, hand cycles and recumbents and e-assist motorized mountain trikes, off-road wheelchairs and stuff. And it's just they all see the fact that technology has come on so much over the last few years, so that it is lighter, it's more reliable, it's more rugged. You can see how much worth they put on the fact that they can now do these things, but they know it's not perfect because it potentially can do more damage. And yes, they can. It's harder for them to do stuff, but I think that means that they add much more value to that. The fact they can actually get to these places and interact with these places and do these things. It's just, like you say, it's so sad when you see the other people who, it's almost like that it's his massive judgment, and you shouldn't be here. And we're having discussions within the trust around more and more people are using e-bikes, e-mountain bikes, and other forms of e-mobility as their mobility aids, which legally they're not mobility aids because the law is a million years out of date. And we're having these huge discussions. If a person comes and they would like to use an e-bike or an e-mountain bike around our estate, where we would let them use a mobility scooter, who are we to say no? And generally, we don't say no. The problem then is it's the other people who then see them, and if there is no physical obvious disability, you don't want to stick them with a yellow tabard and a flag saying "Hello, I'm disabled." It's really it's challenging, but I think there's a lot of stuff happening at the minute that will only improve these things moving forward. But it just needs a bit more enlightenment for the folk out there who just don't see it at all. It's just not on their radar.
But I think that's why Jim's point is so important, right? That there's this sort of tragedy of this nature culture split that is so baked into kind of Western thought. Like, it's gonna take a lot to kind of disassemble that. and for a kind of public understanding of nature to be shifted. So I think I really enjoyed your talk, Jim. I thought it was brilliant.
Oh, thanks, Liam. Tom C, who I think is Tom Campbell. Have you got a question?
And it is.
Ah, guess right.
Thanks, guys. I only came in towards the end of your session, Jim, but super interesting from you both. A couple of questions, I think. Jim, first of all, just wondering, kind of, in terms of what we perceive as e-bikes, and how that's possibly going to, whether that is likely to change. Kind of, if there's maybe going to be a blurring of the distinction between a kind of e-bike as they exist now and a normal bike through kind of the proliferation of technology around like electronic componentry, whether that's gear shifting, seat posts, whatever we have, forthcoming anti-lock braking systems, and kind of even we already have automatically self-adjusting suspension. So even on a non-electric motorized bike, you can have a huge amount of electronic componentry in there, which is kind of just starting to slightly change, I think, maybe the distinction between those two modes of bicycling. And I think even in terms of possibly the implications of some of that. So we know that the e-bikes themselves remove that barrier for entry around physical capabilities. So some of these technologies are arguably having the potential to remove a barrier of entry around your skill set. So if you're introducing things that actually optimize the bike within a certain terrain, makes it safer, means you have to have less skill for braking and all these sorts of things. So just wondering kind of what your thoughts are around that as a potentially really useful development in some ways, and it might just challenge some people's conceptions and perceptions around what an e-bike is, and it's becoming less separate in many ways from a more conventional mountain bike. I've got something for you, Liam, but I'll come to that later.
Cheers, Tom. Great question. I think Leslie is probably the person, Leslie Ingram Sills is probably the person to answer this question, but I'll give it a go. I think I was just writing some kind of characteristics of the e-mountain bike as you were talking there, and I think there are probably, as you well know, there's probably 4 things that most offend outsiders about e-mountain bikes, and these aren't necessarily in any order. One is the level of assistance, or the nature of assistance, which is deemed kind of artificial or unfair, or, as some of my respondents suggested, a kind of a form of cheating. The second one is the weight. E-bikes tend to be heavier, although that's changing. The visual aspect of them, you know, until very recently, you could very clearly see that they were e-bikes. They had a bigger down tube and certain components that made them look like a different bike. And then there's the sound, which is one that I know Leslie has had some experience of with participants as well in her research. You know, that idea that people get scared that e-bikes come up from behind them without them knowing about it. They don't see them, they hear the sound, which can be it can sound quite menacing if you don't know what it is, and then that can kind of startle people. But I think what's fascinating about this, is like, as you rightly point out, where does kind of, in the case of assistance, for instance, where does assistance end and begin? It's like, you know, and this came up frequently in the responses, like, where do we problematize gears? Are we going to problematize drop of seat posts? Are we problematizing thicker tires? It's the same with weight. I always have this conversation with people where I point out that, you know, although e-bikes might be heavier, on average, I'm 20 kilos heavier than many of my friends who I ride with, including yourself and Liam. So does that mean that I'm having an undue impact on the environment? Or you know, what's the problem there? Is it the weight or is it the bike? And I would suggest it's probably the stigma of the technology. Visually, we know that the batteries are getting smaller. You've got the SL versions of a lot of e-bikes now, which are almost indistinguishable from normal bikes. And then sound as well. I rode a Trek EXE the other day, and on the lowest mode, it is almost literally silent. So when we get to the point where all of these things are much less obvious than they ever were, I think real questions are going to be asked about what the difference is. And although we shouldn't have to justify that and make the down tube smaller or make the assistance less to help people, I do think it's going to be a step in the right direction. And I think people's use of them will be stigmatized a lot less as a result. Did you have a question for Liam, did you say?
Yes, I do. Thanks for that. Nice response, Jim. It's super interesting. Liam, I'm fully aware that in your presentation was fascinating. I'm going to have to watch the recording several times to fully understand it. Loving your field notes. I think so. I've fully subscribed to the argument that tracks shouldn't be sanitized, and running the risk of trying not to compare the DIY trail with other types of trail, which I'm as I understand from the theory that you brought in at the outset, that's not what you're looking to do. Not trying to establish equivalence and be able to take one model and apply it to another. But so that I do, however, wonder, so that the idea of the risks and challenges of users that we need in there, that does differ at the individual level. So there is absolutely a requirement for difficult trails, challenges mapping the competence of riders to a certain trail. And I think that kind of happens organically through DIY trails, people knowing where they are and whether they can ride them. But I do, on your point around the apprenticeships is really interesting to me. And I think there is a kind of similarity in there to what happens in the more professional trail building, or what is currently happening in terms of trying to establish a minimum standard, I think, a minimum sort of degree of assurance that things are being done in certain ways, whether that's for the person commissioning the tender to have the trail built. They just want to know that there is a level of kind of gatekeeping and safekeeping within there. And I think the way that apprenticeship is kind of working in a really less formal way, which is totally appropriate for that DIY trail, just seems like a really nice way of kind of providing that minimum standard or the degree of assurance. And it is interesting, certainly within a kind of local context, knowing how trails have been built from really experienced builders, and there are challenges when the younger, possibly less experienced builders come in. And it's, again, without wanting to try and force something which is DIY and very kind of hands on the ground into other structures, it's just exploring whether there's some way of adding a degree of formality to that process of the apprenticeship without kind of certifying things and making it. But just that was just it's not really a question, it's more an observation. I'll stop talking.
No, I think it's a great question, because this is the kind of contradiction of DIY, isn't it? Like as soon as you begin to introduce some kind of framework or way of operating, it's no longer DIY. I think in the book chapter there was a group of kind of dirt jump builders in Copenhagen that I interviewed, who they became very official, and they sort of formed this kind of union. It started out DIY. It was just outside Christiania, so it had this real kind of punk ethos to it. And as soon as they kind of talked about becoming a union and becoming official, half of the kind of original locals like, this isn't for me anymore, went elsewhere. So it's a really difficult thing to navigate. I don't really know the question, I don't really know the answer to that, but I think something about these kind of this kind of notion of of improvisation and the kind of informal networks. I guess it's like doing things like this, like starting to kind of understand what they look like and where to kind of, how to intervene in the very kind of minute or what's the word that I'm looking for, kind of appropriate ways, I guess. I don't know. It's a really good question though. I mean, I know that I know a trail association that has really good connections with kind of DIY builders. these are all people that you meet out in the woods, and so you have these sort of informal networks already. And I guess it's a question of sort of figuring out how to cultivate them and care for them and look after them and recognize their fragility, right?
Totally.
Yeah. I don't know if that helped.
No, it does. Yeah, super. Nice one. Thanks.
Cheers, Tom. We'll just, if it's okay, I'm conscious of the time. We'll finish. Hannah's had a hand up patiently for about 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll have one final question from Hannah, and then we'll wrap up.
Just at the point you came to me, my internet decided to bottle it. But can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No, I was just coming back to what you were talking about with disabled riders, and I just wondered if there'd been, or if you'd heard any resentment from riders with disabilities against able-bodied people opting to use an e-bike when conceivably they did have the physical capacity to ride a conventional bike.
No, I haven't. I haven't heard anybody say that, but it would have been in retrospect, it would have been an interesting question to ask somehow. Yeah, why do you ask that question, Hannah?
Because I've heard it in a group of older riders, which is my area of interest, where someone has said he's riding an e-bike, he doesn't need to, and then there's that judgment, but also this sort of perception of cheating is maybe created by able-bodied, physically fit riders opting to use an e-mountain bike for, uplift, or just, because they simply, like, let's face it, enjoy riding an e-bike rather than riding it out of necessity. So I just wondered if the able-bodied rider on an e-bike is creating this kind of ethos of cheating or stigmatizing of e-bikes because they're using a tool that is not necessarily essential for their ability to partake in mountain biking.
Yeah, what I would say is I'm probably not familiar with the critical disability studies literature writ large to be able to provide a sufficient answer to that in the context of disability. But I suspect what you might find is this is all about ideology for me, and I guess after people like Gramsci, who was a Marxist in the kind of turn of the century, one of the things he was suggesting about ideology is that, we sometimes assume that ideology is a powerful group kind of imposing their will or their view on a less powerful group. But in this case, I would expect there to be instances where often ideology is so strong, i.e. the ideology of how to use green space and what you should do with your body and what technology isn't appropriate in those spaces, that it probably gets adopted by people with impairments as well. It probably forms part of their identities as much as it does, because a lot of these people I spoke to didn't always have impairments. They were once able-bodied, and their impression of the outdoors will probably be as strong as anyone else's as a result of that. So yeah, I would very much expect a lot of, and maybe that's, one of my colleagues who, Jack Black, he would argue that sometimes it's really important to acknowledge that they may well be disabled, but sometimes people who are disempowered can be as horrible as those who are empowered. And that's all the result of ideology and how strong a draw some ideologies, in this case of green exercise, can be. Cheers, Hannah. Graham,
it was only on just in relation to that, actually. A lot of some of the people I've spoken to, both disabled users of e-bikes and as a kit, and that it's not necessarily it's the perception of the improper use of the piece of kit, I think, is the key. So lots of people who ride e-bikes because they can ride for longer and have a much better experience overall, which they couldn't do. Yes, they could ride up the hills, but by the time it's the third hill, they'll be blowing out the backside and stuff. It's that, I think it's for the people I've spoken to, it's that perception of, well, they're cheating because they're kind of always sticking it on boost and burning up the hills. That basically being a bit of a dick about it. And it's that side of it that where I've heard it come from. It's the misappropriation of the equipment and the tools and and the benefits of it, rather than rather than anything else.
Yeah, and one thing I think on that highlights how powerful, I'm using the word ideology, but expectations are about e-bikes, is the fact that even when you've bought one, like when I wrote another paper on this previously, which where we elaborate on this, even when you've bought one and you feel confident in your purchase and why you've bought it, nearly everyone I know and everyone I speak to who has an e-mountain bike still spends an inordinate amount of time talking you through why they bought it, justifying it, and then you get into well, I only use it on eco anyway all the time because I like to stay fit and I never go on turbo, or I only treat myself to a bit of turbo every now and again. So and that is just because you've got an e-bike doesn't mean you're exempt from those stigmas. They're still there, and that counts for able-bodied as well as disabled or impaired users of the countryside as much.
I just think it's sorry, Jim. I mean, like, I don't understand the kind of internal policing between bike riders. I don't think I ever will. But yeah, it's I don't understand what makes someone feel as though they need to police somebody else's behavior, whether they're on an e-bike or not. It just seems kind of mad to me. But
Indeed. I think we should probably wrap up, but I'll just pop this just before we go as a reminder of the next session. So thank you, Liam.
Thank you
for presenting today. Come on. Oh, okay, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you, Liam, for presenting. Really appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a difficult time to find time to come to these things, so yeah, it's always great to see so many of you. Just a reminder, put this on screen. Can you see that? Can you just confirm, Liam, that you can see that? This is the schedule of events. Obviously, we've completed the first of 4. April is the next one, where Albert Arias, who was on the call earlier, will be telling us all about some of the controversies around mountain bike practices in the Parc de Collserola, Barcelona. And then we've got Brendan Munge, who's going to be calling in at about 5 a.m. in the morning, because he will be calling from Australia, who conveniently is also going to be telling us about what people's motivations are to ride in Queensland, Australia. So yeah, come and join us for that if you can. No worries if you can't. And thanks again for joining, everyone.
Thanks both, really good.